Hey everyone, welcome to the first slightly slimmed down episode of Chrontendo. A mere 10 games. Though we do have a very long game this time, so this is still a pretty beefy episode. We're going to finish off January 1990 with a few games not released in Japan, and then we'll take a pretty huge bite out of February. And we've got two very good titles, and also a few of the worst games I've seen in a while. Our buddies Micronics make a big comeback this episode, and I'm quite happy about that. Once again, I will plug the Chrontendo Patreon, and once again let me thank everyone out there for their support. I'm definitely planning on making some improvements to a few things about Chrontendo, but right now I have a little announcement. When I first decided to do this Patreon, I didn't want to put any pressure on people to become patrons or feel any sort of obligation. A lot of folks set goals like if I get to X number of dollars, I'll do this. So while I didn't really announce anything, I did come up with a couple of things I thought people would enjoy and said to myself, if the Patreon reaches a certain number of dollars, I'll do them as a bonus for everyone. The Patreon certainly exceeded my expectations and blew past the goalposts that I had mentally set. So I'm now committed to doing a few extra things for everyone. Once I get started on the first one, I'll release some more details. But for right now, though, let's get going on episode 55. Okay kids, break out the champagne. It's finally here, the game you've been waiting for, the Chessmaster, from High Tech Expressions. I'm pretty sure this is the first High Tech Expressions games we've encountered in Chrontendo. There will be a few more, like the NES Barbie game, but they were mostly a producer of computer games. So I'm thinking that the Chessmaster is like the first normal chess game we've had. I mean, other than Archon or that sort of thing. I mean, we've had so many Ego games and Mahjong games, I can't believe there hasn't been a chess game, but maybe you guys will remember if I'm correct or not. I'll give Chessmaster this. It has a nice interface. You move pieces around by clicking once to pick up the piece, and then a second time to put them down. On the screen it shows a history of recent moves up in the upper left. There's hints in the upper right, as well as captured pieces on the right. It's completely clear of logos, ornate borders, or extraneous text, the kind of stuff that you often see on ports of computer games. Also, this thing has a lot of options. You can change the difficulty, screen setup, turn hints on and off, all kinds of customizations. I mean, the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a computer game, but that we don't normally see in games originally developed for an 8-bit console. So as you have probably figured out, this is a port of a computer game, originally released in 1986 as the Chessmaster 2000. I'm not sure if this has mouse support or not. It appears that you have to type in with the keyboard which piece you want to move, and then which square you want to move it to. This was developed by Software Toolworks, who you might know from their educational Mario games, such as Mario's Missing. The Chessmaster series kept going until 2007, and the box art always had this wizardy looking dude on the cover. Incidentally, the actual guy used for the box art was an actor named William Hare. He had a long career going back to the 50s, and was mostly a TV actor, appearing in countless series in the 70s like Streets of San Francisco or Starsky and Hutch. He was sort of typecast as old coots and grandfathers and such. He had some small roles in a few somewhat well-known feature films like Enter the Ninja and Silent Night, Deadly Night, but I'm going to guess most people will remember him as Old Man Peabody in Back to the Future, the guy who sees Marty emerge from the DeLorean and assumes he's an alien. Chessmaster was, at the time, the best-selling chess game series, with millions of copies sold by the 2000s. It's a pretty sophisticated program and even beat Grandmaster Larry Christensen in a 4-game match. I wasn't quite sure what to do with this video since I'm certainly not capable of judging Chessmaster's playing skills, so I thought, what will happen if I make Chessmaster battle itself? Specifically have the Nintendo Chessmaster go up against Chessmaster 3000, the 1990 computer version. So I fired up both, with the NES playing black and the PC game playing white. I figured the PC game would have more processing power at its disposal, so I cranked up the skill level of black on the NES version by a few levels. The PC game seemed to do pretty well from the get-go, taking out 2 knights relatively quickly, though it eventually lost both of its bishops. Eventually, though, it became quite clear that white, the computer version, was dominating, forcing black's king to run, and finally trapping it between 2 rooks. So in this case, the PC Chessmaster handily defeated the NES Chessmaster. Maybe someday the Super Nintendo Chessmaster will do better. Oh man, that beautiful Mindscape logo. And you gotta love that font. Look at the E character used in this font. This is apparently the work of Beam Software. Roadblasters is sort of an action driving game. It's more or less Spy Hunter in 3D. This is sort of a difficulty setting screen. You can choose which area you want to start in. Each consists of several levels. The entire game has 12 areas, and they get more difficult as you progress. Obviously, this was published by Mindscape, which was a pretty prominent publisher of computer games who were starting to get into console games around this time. They had already released a few NES ports of Atari arcade games in the late 80s. We've already covered several of these: Paperboy, 720 Degrees, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. They also released quite a few console games in the 90s, including some of the later Chessmaster games. They eventually folded and now only exist in name only. The original arcade game came out in 1987, and it felt a lot more modern than something like Super Sprint, which we covered last episode. It had a pretty cool sit-down cabinet, and some pretty rad music. It was a relatively modern, hip, reasonably exciting combat racing game. So Roadblasters revolves around 3 things: shooting cars and picking up fuel, and racking up a high score, which is actually important. I'll explain in just a few minutes. As you can see, your fuel depletes pretty quickly, and running out of fuel is the only thing that kills you. You can crash your car as much as you want, as long as you don't run out of fuel. Those green globe things that are just lying in the road, that's actually fuel. Your car burns fuel super quick, so you always need to be picking up any fuel that you find. And sometimes cars will drop fuel when you shoot them, so shooting cars is good. Now, here's the tricky part. You get points for shooting cars. Big whoop, right? Who cares about points in an NES game? But in Roadblasters, points will get you fuel. You see that multiplier box in the corner? Every time you blow up a car, it goes up by 1, with 10 being the maximum. So shooting a standard enemy car while you have a multiplier of 10 will get you 500 points instead of the normal 50 points. But every time you fire and miss a car, it goes down by 1. At the end of each level, your score is tallied, and this determines how much fuel you'll get in the reserve tank. So ideally, you want to have the score multiplier at 10 in order to get the maximum amount of fuel at the end of each level. As long as you have fuel, you can keep playing. Now, to further complicate things, you will occasionally get special weapon drops. These are superior to your regular guns, but they have no impact on the score multiplier. So typically you want to use them after you've already got the multiplier up to 10. The manual doesn't really fill you in as to what's going on in terms of a plot. It just says Roadblasters takes place in the future where, quote, survival is the only law, end quote. So you sort of assume this takes place in some kind of post-apocalyptic world. It must be like some kind of Road Warrior style situation. You're battling a gang of psychopaths who travel the freeways stealing gasoline or something. You know, but eventually it strikes you, none of the other cars on the road appear to have any weapons. And none of the other cars really attack you in any way. They're just driving down the road. You're the one who has a machine gun mounted to his car and who's doing all the shooting. There's definitely a strong "are we the baddies" moment here, as you realize that you're the psychopath, tearing down the highway, murdering everyone you come across. It's basically the NES version of Spec Ops: The Line. Now, Roadblasters appears to be some sort of cross-promotional deal between Matchbox and Atari. There was an entire line of Roadblasters toy cars released by Matchbox in 1987. As far as I can tell, this wasn't a huge success, and the toy line was discontinued in '88. So by the time this NES port came out, you couldn't buy the toys anymore. One odd little footnote. Roadblasters makes an appearance in the 2012 Disney movie Wreck-It Ralph, as a flashy new game that steals the spotlight from the older arcade racing game. So for a port of an arcade racing game, it's reasonably engaging. There's a little bit of strategy involved. It's more than just driving. So really not a bad way to waste 20 minutes or so. Oh boy, Infiltrator, one of the most infamous NES games of the early 90s. Published by Mindscape and perhaps a little less user-friendly than Chessmaster. Is this the Mission Impossible theme but using video game sound effects? Boy, this is just awful. So we start off with this hilarious tongue-in-cheek intro. So you are this super cool secret agent dude named Jimbo McGibbets, who accepts a mission to, well, infiltrate an enemy base and neutralize some poison gas being manufactured by the Mad Leader, who is directly copied from this John Buscema drawing of the Grim Reaper from issue 79 of the Avengers. Okay, so Infiltrator has two distinct parts, a helicopter flying simulator and a top-down action game that sort of resembles Metal Gear. Now, if you rented this back in the day and didn't have a manual, you were pretty much screwed, because it is not obvious at all what to do. First of all, you need to hit the start button to turn on the helicopter. Now you can start using the controls and flying. There's a lot of stuff inside the helicopter cockpit, and it looks pretty imposing, but we'll very quickly explain what it all is and how to fly the copter. Okay, so let's start with the gauges and whatnot right in front of you. Upper left is your speed, next to that is the automated direction finder, which basically tells you which direction the enemy base is in. Then there's the altimeter, below that is the RPM meter. The artificial horizon shows the angle the copter is moving in relative to the horizon, and then the compass shows you which direction you're flying in, not to be confused with the automatic direction finder. To the right there is a fuel gauge, obviously. Up above it are warning lights. They will light up if there's a problem for various parts of the copter. From left to right there's engine, battery, which can overheat, oil, which can also overheat, fuel, which can run out, altitude, meaning that you're flying too low and you're going to crash, and RPM, which also means you might crash. On either side of the warning lights, we have warning gauges for the battery and the oil. Now on either side of the dials and gauges, we have like a control panel with lots of buttons. You use the select button to scroll through them, and the A button to select the actual button. On the left, we have missiles, guns, chaff, which shoots out little metal strips to confuse enemy radar-based missiles, Then flares, which confuse heat-seeking missiles. On the right, there's radio, which allows you to use the radio, duh. Status, which takes you to the status screen. Turbo, which makes your copter go faster but causes the battery to overheat, and the oil to overheat. And finally, Whisper, which is kind of like stealth mode. You use this when landing the helicopter so you don't get caught by the enemies, and this also causes the oil to overheat. There's also some flashing lights on either side. I have no idea if those mean anything. Now that everything is completely clear, you can fly the copter, but in order to find the enemy base, you need to set up the automated direction finder, which, as a reminder, is the top middle dial thing. So you go into the status screen and find the ADF number. Then you exit the status screen, go to the radio screen and select the ADF, and then use the D-pad to enter in the ADF number from the status screen. Hopefully you are all following along. Now you're ready to fly, but watch out for enemy aircraft who can communicate via the radio. They will send you an ID number, which will identify them either as friend or enemy, and then you signal back to them with the correct code phrase so they won't attack you. Now how do you know which code numbers are for enemies and which are for the good guys? Simple. You don't. The game doesn't tell you. Regardless of whether or not they think you're a friend or a foe, you will definitely get attacked at some point by enemies who are really hard to hit, and you will probably get shot down and get a game over. Okay, so now that we've tried that, let's go on to something else. Luckily, the developers knew that the helicopter section is impossible, so you can just skip it and go straight to the enemy base. So this is like the bargain basement Metal Gear part of the game. You land near the enemy base, which is a 3x3 grid of screens, and wander around the various buildings looking for the items you need to complete the objective. Now since this is a Mindscape game, it's no surprise that this was a port of a computer game. The original Infiltrator was released in 1986 for DOS and the Commodore 64, and apparently sold quite well. The game that rocked America, as it was advertised overseas, and it was designed by Chris Gray, who had previously worked on the popular computer game Boulder Dash. After Infiltrator, Gray worked on a lot of console games you've probably heard of, like Captain Planet for the NES, B.O.B., Wayne's World, and Ren and Stimpy Vidiots. For a time, his company, Grey Matter Incorporated, was the largest video game developer in Canada. Incidentally, this game is not actually a port of the 1986 Infiltrator computer game. It is in fact a port of the sequel, Infiltrator 2, from 1987. These games were not actually very well received by critics. Computer Gaming World gave Infiltrator 2 0 out of 4 stars in his review. But it did apparently sell well enough to end up on the NES. People obviously compare this to Metal Gear, of course, though the original Infiltrator game came out 1 year before Metal Gear. The basic concept of stealth games wasn't exactly new back then. I mean, the original Castle Wolfenstein was released in 1981, and stealth isn't really much of an option in Infiltrator. While you're in the buildings, you can't exactly hide. Enemies will easily spot you since all the rooms are just empty rectangles. You'll be asked for your papers, which you need to select from the items menu and then use the papers on the guard. The guard will sometimes accept the papers and sometimes recognize them as fake. When this happens, you need to quickly go back into your item menu, select the sleeping gas, and then use it on the guard. This is pretty tiresome, but luckily there is a janitor uniform tucked away in a closet somewhere on the base. If you find that and put it on, the guards will mostly ignore you. And that's pretty much the entire game. Now you can't kill guards, you have no real weapons or gizmos other than the mine detector. Unlike Metal Gear, with its sizable collection of weapons, items, and equipment, you have only a few usable items in the game, and it's very repetitive. There's no boss battles or anything like that. You beat each level by finding some special item, like poison gas neutralizer, and then using this item somewhere else in the level, such as adding it to the poison gas vat. There are 3 separate missions, and each of them looks more or less the same, just different building layouts. The game is on a timer, and there are multiple buildings to explore, so how you would play this game would be to wander around the level and die when the timer runs out, then you restart and try again, until you've explored enough that you know where the important items are so that you can just go directly to them and beat the level before the timer runs out. So it's very much a trial and error game. And of course a lot of games from this era are trial and error, but Infiltrator is just tiresome and boring. It's just moving through a series of identical rooms and opening filing cabinets until you just happen to find a particular item that will allow you to complete the level. It's dull and repetitive. There are no surprises, no cool boss fights against helicopters, nothing. It's just an extremely frustrating helicopter simulation game tacked on to a low-grade stealth game. The cart is very common and super cheap. No one likes this game, and I feel bad for the kids who paid $40 for it or whatever back in 1990. I mean, good luck playing this today without an online guide or a walkthrough. It's a bad game, and not even really like in an interesting way, just sort of a boring way. I'm actually kind of mad that I had to spend any time actually playing this thing. We've got two Konami games today, and this one is definitely the lesser of the two. Kings of the Beach is actually published by Ultra Games, and this is, of course, a US-only release. So this is clearly a beach volleyball game, the third volleyball game for the system, I think. And like many US-developed sports games, this is based around real-life sports figures, namely Randy Stoklos and St. John Smith, who were the reigning Kings of the Beach at this time. The Stoklos-Smith team was pretty much dominating the sport at the time this came out, winning the first four FIVB Beach Volleyball World Series from 1989 to 1992, and they apparently still today hold the record for the most professional volleyball wins at 114.
The Miller Lite Grand Prix winners for 1991, Smith and Stoklos. The slump is over. That's the performance of the year. Played so poorly in the game to 15.
Now this game was originally developed by EA, and it's the second EA game that Konami published for the NES, the first being Skate or Die. In fact, both games have sort of a similar hub section at the beginning. Here you can start a new game or enter a password for an existing game. You select the various options in this menu. Up to 4 people can play at once. And there's also a very hard to read copyright notice on the screen for some reason. And then there are also these areas where you can practice bumps and spikes and whatnot. Now when you're ready to actually play a game, you can do a one-off match or a full tournament. The tournament consists of 5 games, each in a different locale: San Diego, Chicago, Waikiki, Rio, and somewhere in Australia. This is actually very faithful to the original PC version, except for one thing: the music. Damn, this is a banger. This music is by Ron Hubbard. The somewhat higher resolution on the DOS version makes it a bit more pleasant to look at. And here's one funny thing: the players can dispute a ref's call and argue with him, sometimes earning you a yellow card if you make him mad. The NES game clearly has these softer and more muted colors, but other than that, the games are quite similar. You have a variety of realistic moves you can pull off, spikes, blocks, etc. I didn't really get the hang of the controls while playing this, but I guess the game seems pretty good. I like all the little touches, like the character animations, like kicking the sand when you get mad and that sort of thing. Each locale has its own background. Here is Waikiki, for example. In terms of NES volleyball games, I don't think this has ever reached the level of popularity as Nintendo's own volleyball game, or Super Spike V-Ball. I mean, there's nothing really wrong with Kings of the Beach. It's pretty slick and has a decent amount of personality, but there's only room for so many volleyball games in people's hearts, and I think Super Spike V-Ball is the one that people actually remember and still like today. February 1990 is here, and we're going to blow through almost the entire month this episode. This is one of those games that I had absolutely no idea what it was until I started playing it. Cadillac from Hector. Now the name Cadillac doesn't really imply any particular type of game, like a racing game, maybe? I don't know. But it turns out this is Tetris, but with playing cards. Now there is an actual card game called Cadillac, it's more commonly called 31, but there is no connection whatsoever between that game and this video game. I guess that kid is you? You seem to be a little bit young to be gambling, but... So this is how the game is played. You have a deck of 52 cards, one card at a time is dealt, and it falls towards the bottom of the screen, just like in Tetris. The D-pad will move the card horizontally from column to column. You can also use up or down on the D-pad to speed up or slow down the rate at which the card is falling. In Tetris, of course, you need to fill in a horizontal row in order to make that row disappear. In Cadillac, you need to line up at least 3 cards into some sort of order, typically a straight or a flush. This can be done either horizontally or vertically, and once you have 3 in a row, those cards will disappear. You also get money for each hand you clear. The ultimate goal of each round is to have no cards left on the screen once the entire deck has been played. In practice, this is very difficult, if not impossible. However, any cards left on the screen will be tallied and then deducted from your earnings at $50 per card. If your money drops below 0, the game is over. Now there is a sort of risk versus reward factor at play. Flushes, that is, 3 cards of the same suite, are easy to set up, but only pay $10. A straight, that is 3 consecutive cards, such as 5, 6, 7, pays $100, and a straight flush, say 5, 6, 7 of diamonds, pays $500, or 50 times as much as a regular flush. So this is a simple, fun, easy-to-learn game which can be a little challenging. One very strange thing is that a decade later, in 1999, Hector released an updated version of this for the PlayStation. One in a series of titles they released which were based on gambling games that they released with these extremely generic covers. I suppose that if Cadillac warranted a remake, then the original must have done somewhat okay? My final verdict, Cadillac is decent, but clearly encourages underage gambling. Alright, the big action game this episode, Super Contra, the sequel to, well, just regular Contra, I guess. Developed and published by Konami. Once again Bill, codename Mad Dog, and Lance, codename Scorpio, need to stop an alien invasion of some sort. Well, not even quite an invasion, more like an infestation. The aliens seem pretty well established, and the underground tunnels and such are just full of them. Should I point out that Bill's last name is Ko? Bill Ko? Super Contra is the first of 2 run-and-gun type games this episode. Super Contra is really good. The other one is, well, you'll see. In the US, of course, this was released under the name Super C, to avoid people making any connections to the Iran-Contra scandal. You should recall that the arcade Super C was released in 1988, and the scandal was still very fresh in people's minds.
What is this place? Keep your eyes peeled.
The arcade game is pretty hard. It's definitely more of a quarter muncher, and while it looks spectacular, your character is bigger and feels slower. Power-up capsules just seem to tear across the screen super fast, and they're much harder to shoot. It looks sick as hell though. By comparison, the console version makes your sprite much more compact and much more agile. You can jump around and pull off air spins like a damn maniac. Good luck hitting this guy. Super C comes pretty strong right out of the gates. After getting dropped off by a helicopter, you hit the ground with guns blazing, mowing down members of the US military who have been brainwashed by aliens. I'm sure that's fine and that the US Army is okay with that. I mean, stealth is not the Contra boys' modus operandi. First boss, a helicopter. Shoot out the gun turrets, kill all the guys who jump out at the back, and finally hammer away at the weak spot. And blam, he's done. Super Contra disposed of the first-person levels and instead adds several top-down sequences, sort of like an Akari Warriors vibe here. If you've played Contra before, you know there's one rule: get the spread gun. With this bad boy, you become an unstoppable wall of death. Giant tanks blocking your way? No problem. I also love these giant walls with their dramatic foreshortening. And this is great. This giant tank thing with 3 guns, you can just walk up behind it and shoot it in the rear end, and it'll go up in flames real quick. Level 3 Tropics of Torture is a jungle level where tons of enemies are coming from all sides. And again, the strategy is just keep moving forward. This pop-up missile launcher, for example. It'll be a real pain if you get caught in all the missiles that it rains down on you, but with a heavy gun you can just bulldoze right through it before it even fires anything off. And that is a pretty good strategy for Super C in general. Just keep moving forward, don't ever stop shooting, and don't slow down or all the enemies will catch up with you. The game clearly borrows elements from 80s action-adventure movies. Aside from Lance's Rambo-esque headband, the arcade flyer straight up mentions Predator, and the art is lifted directly from the Rambo poster. After the jungle, you probably have the worst section of the game, where the ground starts collapsing below your feet and you have to keep jumping from ledge to avoid falling to your death. It's one of those situations where if you aren't right on the edge when you jump, you won't quite make it and you'll fall. And this all leads to a kind of lame boss. A bit later we get this cool elevator sequence as enemies sweep down and attack you from above. Super C is pretty relentless, and it can be brutally difficult, especially if you're stuck with a weak gun. Now, one of the issues people have with Super C, it's one of those examples of a game being made more difficult for the US market. The Japanese version had a secret code for 30 lives. It wasn't the well-known Konami code, it was a different code, but in the US, this code only gave you 10 lives. The Japanese version also has a hidden level select option, which is again missing from the US release. The 30 lives cheat was included in the European version, known as Probotector 2. Just like the first Contra game, this version has everyone changed into robots. One interesting theme that is new to Super C is the use of inclined surfaces. The game starts you running up some hills, which is sort of unusual for an NES game. The same trick appears here as you fight your way through these series of floating islands. The next boss is this ugly dude, who feels like an alien version of the first boss, the helicopter. As we enter the home stretch, we have another top-down sequence, a rather irritating section where you just get attacked by all sides from what I believe were originally supposed to look like the facehuggers from Alien. And this guy was originally the final boss in the arcade game. The first and very easy part is a fake-out, and then the real boss appears. In the arcade game, he has like this alien embryo thing in his brain and you need to shoot that, but in the console version you just need to blast him in the face. The game's finale has you just descending deeper and deeper into the alien hive, until you meet the real final boss. Opinions on Super C, both past and present, are mixed. Famista gave it a mere 25 out of 40. Asking around on Twitter, a number of folks thought it was a bit disappointing after the original NES Contra. I personally like it. It's so fast-paced, the weapons are overpowered, you just run around like a damn idiot, killing stuff. You're also just so nimble, doing mid-air spins while firing your gun. It's the exact opposite of Batman, with your very slow, deliberate movement, and having to constantly crouch down to kill smaller enemies. Something that I personally found very annoying about Batman. And it can be quite tough, especially some of the platforming levels like this, where you need to deal with a moving ceiling that limits your ability to jump, enemies are rushing in behind you, and those bubble things are closing in on you. Okay, so here's the final boss. He's new to the console version, and would return in later Contra games. Super C must have been pretty successful as Konami continued to pump out Contra console games. The series eventually switched from 2D to 3D in the PlayStation era, and then later went back to its 2D roots for a handheld game. I'd say it's definitely the best action game we've seen for the NES in the last few episodes. Okay, now on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, as Super C, it's a big ol' honkin' historical simulation game. I hope you like warring feudal states because it's Nobunaga no Yabou 2. This is Koei's sequel to Nobunaga no Yabou 1, released for the Famicom in March 1988, so this sequel was 2 years in the making. Like the first game, this is centered around the time of Nobunaga Oda, a 16th century feudal lord. Nobunaga lived during the Sengouku period of Japan, often called the Warring States period in English. Basically, he pursued a policy of unifying Japan, fought and conquered a bunch of rival feudal lords, got betrayed, and had to commit suicide. But he's still considered to be the guy who pretty much kickstarted Japan's unification. The first game did pretty well in the US, so this sequel got a release in the US in April 1991 under the name Nobunaga's Ambition 2. The thing about this game is, it's pretty slick. It expands on the original game a bit. And hey look, it's your boy, Takeda Shingen. He had his own strategy game on the NES. 2 actually, published by Hot B. There are 2 scenarios you can play, Warlord Rivalry, which takes place in the 1560s and has a bunch of warlords ruling over small fiefs. The second one is Nobunaga's Ambition, which fast forwards 20 years and there are fewer warlords left. The game is pretty complicated for an NES game. The manual is like 80 pages long, and we have just lots of menus and options and commands and so on. The first step is to choose a warlord, or daimyo, as they say. In theory, it's easier to choose a fief that isn't surrounded by a lot of rival fiefs. That way you're not, surrounded on all sides by enemies. The basic strategy is just like any other Civ-type game. Improve your kingdom by clearing lands, expanding towns, taking anti-flood measures, and fortifying your castle. This allows you to make more money and build bigger armies. You can also buy or sell food and weapons, you can engage in diplomacy with the other daimyos, you can send out spies or assassins, try to recruit ronin, that is, unemployed samurais, or try to lure samurais away from their fiefs. And of course you train soldiers and also fight wars. Now one thing that's new to this game is the introduction of samurai as the agents which actually perform most of the game's actions. You, the daimyo, have multiple samurai at your disposal, each with their own stats. Whenever a samurai performs an action like training troops or improving the land, they use what the game calls body points. That's a pretty weird term, but it's basically just action points. Performing an action uses up points, and then between turns they have some points replenished. So in other words, a samurai has limits as to how many tasks they can actually perform during each turn. Now this concept was borrowed from an earlier Koei game, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a game that has generals that are used to carry out your orders. Koei must have really liked the concept since they employed it in the Nobunaga games, starting with this one. Now aside from all of that, you can of course fight your rival daimyos. You just move your army guys into a neighboring fief, and then blam! Next thing you know, it's time for hex-based combat. You have different types of units, horses, infantry, riflemen. I'm pretty outnumbered here, and this will not turn out well for me. Now as you know, I'm not really fond of playing these complex computer games on the NES. I mean, a console like this just does not seem like the right platform for a strategy game. Don't get me wrong, I like Civilization and Age of Empires and Warcraft and all that kind of junk, but I think that style of gameplay really benefits from having a mouse. The NES just isn't really that good for displaying lots of text or detailed maps. And remember, Nobunaga's ambition started out as a computer game. In fact, this game was originally released for Japanese computers in 1988 and was even released for computers in the US in 1989. And this looks pretty damn functional. You can actually type in numbers using your keyboard rather than scrolling through menus with the D-pad. I suppose that in later iterations of the series, the Nobunaga games became a bit more playable on consoles. It's interesting that we have so many ports this episode of both computer games and arcade games, 7 out of 10. And Cadillac is the only true original game this episode, as the other two games are a sequel and a TV adaptation. I feel like this almost must be like a record for an episode of Chrontendo. Wow, okay, here's one game I was not expecting. Mottomo Abunai Deka, published by Toei, the gigantic animation company, and developed by Micronix. And let me tell you, most Micronix games we've been seeing lately have been kind of boring. There were a couple of ports of arcade shoot-em-ups in 1989, and a generic RPG, but this is a return to the classic Micronix style. Alright, so there's not much here in terms of an intro. The game just starts right in the middle of the action. Literally 1 second after the game itself loads, an enemy appears on the right side of the screen, charging at you. So how do you play this game? Well, it's simple, just run to the right and constantly fire your gun. And that's pretty much it for the first level. You do have to jump over some boxes at one point. So I guess we could say when the opportunity arose to make an exciting action game, these guys really missed the boat. The second level throws in a few curveballs. There's gunmen firing at you from the windows, and in theory you need to shoot them while jumping up. In practice, they're kinda hard to hit, and when using the pistol, the bullets often fly right over their heads. Not that this really matters, since you have a pretty long life bar, and health refills appear pretty frequently. later in the game you have to be a bit more careful. I love the fact that at the end of this level, these two cops are just like standing in front of this building, apparently unconcerned that there's dozens of maniacs shooting off guns in the streets. So you're probably thinking, yeah, there's gotta be some kind of story behind this thing. Well, this is an adaptation of a popular Japanese TV cop show. Abunai Deka first ran from 1986 to 1987. The title translates to, roughly, Dangerous Detectives. It was about these two sharply dressed police detectives and was clearly patterned after Miami Vice. A second series, Moto Abunai Deka, or More Dangerous Detectives, ran from 1988 to 89. And this game is technically a tie-in to that series, despite the game being released a few months after the show was off the air. There were a few movies made and an occasional TV revival, as well as countless soundtrack albums, spin-off series, and, as far as I can tell, just this one video game. Now it's kind of funny, years ago I'd made a video about the worst games for the Famicom and Nintendo for the first few years of the system, and people sometimes ask me if I'm ever going to do a second one for more recent years, but the thing is, by this point in the NES history, 89 or 90, there are boring games, there's uninspired games, but the system has matured enough that there's some sort of minimum standard that games have to meet. And sure, there are still a few things like Back to the Future, but like the Wild West era, where pretty much anything could be released, is over. And then suddenly, Mottomo Abunai Deka just comes rising out of the swamp, and it's like we're back in 1986 again. Seriously, this game is like black tar Kosoge, just inject it directly into my veins. This is like Super Pitfall level Kosoge. Now, as you may have noticed, you can pick up little Uzis and grenades. These are alternate weapons with limited ammo, which you can use if you feel like it. And there are bosses, sort of. This guy is just a regular dude who can just take a lot of bullets. And then there's this flamethrower dude who appears at the end of a couple levels. And just look at the fireball sprites. I mean, they look like hairballs. This is a short game. I looked at a complete playthrough, and from the very beginning to the end of the next to last level was about 11 minutes. The last level is a little bit longer than average, maybe 5 minutes, and that's mostly because you have to climb up and down a lot of stairs, and your character does this very slowly. Also, for some reason, there is a very short but still annoying driving sequence where you have 95 seconds to reach your destination. If you fail, then you get a game over. Alright, so the last level is a big room with stairs. But the best part of this is the music. And once again, the final boss is just this dude standing in his office. You need to shoot him in the dick a bunch of times. I guess there's a reason that so many shooter games like Contra have these fanciful settings full of monsters and robots and stuff, so that the game's climax isn't just shooting some dude wearing an ugly brown suit in the dick. And that's it. The end. No moral. Okay folks, the second big game this episode, and it's a whopper. Dragon Quest IV, developed and published by Enix, and made by pretty much the regular Dragon Quest team: Yuji Horii, Akira Toriyama, Koichi Sugiyama, and so on. I'll just put in a random name here. The actual characters in this game all have preset names that you can't change. This seems to have had a longer development time compared to the earlier games. Dragon Quest III came out in 1988, so there was a 2-year gap between 3 and 4. And Dragon Warrior 4, the US version, didn't get released until October 1992, 2.5 years after the original Japanese release. Though of course Dragon Quest III didn't hit the US until 91. Now, unlike Dragon Quest III, there weren't many changes made to the US version. It's a relatively straight localization. 1990 was the year of 2 great Famicom RPGs, Dragon Quest IV and Final Fantasy III, which would be released in April. Both were groundbreaking RPGs in different ways, and when comparing the two we can see how the two series are sort of branching off into totally different ways. Essentially, Dragon Quest III innovated with narrative by using an unusual 5-part story structure, and Final Fantasy III innovated with game mechanics by creating an extremely flexible and customizable job system. Over the years, the core mechanics of Dragon Quest don't really change that much, though the game will always throw a couple curveballs at you. But it always feels familiar, and today, new Dragon Quest games impart a feeling of nostalgia. But with Final Fantasy, everyone gets upset because each new Final Fantasy game changes the whole thing around. If you loved Final Fantasy VII, you might hate Final Fantasy VIII, or 12, or 13, or all of them. So Dragon Quest IV's main thing is that rather than being one long, unbroken narrative, like most JRPGs of the time, it's 5 separate chapters, each with a different protagonist. Though in practicality, it feels more like 4 prologues, followed by the actual main game. There are a lot of charming little grace notes throughout the game, like this old dude waiting outside the castle who offers to join you, though he walks so slowly that you'll have to stop every few steps to wait for him to catch up. And no, you can't actually take him along with you on your quest. He'll follow you around the town, but when you exit and head out onto the world map, he'll automatically disappear and return back to his spot outside the castle. Now, I can't blame people for not wanting to play through Dragon Warrior 4 in this day and age. It is soul-crushingly relentless and incredibly long. And the inventory system? Ooh boy, we'll talk about that later. So part 1 has you playing as Ragnar, a soldier in the Berland army. I assume he's a commander of some sort since he has different armor and wears this plumed helmet. In town you will find the normal Dragon Quest shops: items, weapon, and armor shops. Many of the items and equipment are just carried over from the earlier games, so your standard usable items are all here: medicinal herbs, antidote herbs, full moon herbs, fairy water, seeds that increase your stats. For armor we have leather armor, half-plate armor, full-plate armor, dragon mail, iron masks, and so on, all returning from Dragon Quest III. And returning weapons include the copper sword, the poison needle, the battle axe, the broadsword, zombie killer, chain sickle, as well as various cursed weapons, like the multi-edged sword. So when you walk up to a shop for the first time, you'll be familiar with most of the stuff on sale. Dragon Quest IV does replace a lot of the higher-end items, however. It introduces the powerful metal babble sword and armor, though later games would actually translate these as liquid metal items, rather than metal babble. So the game starts you out in the middle of crisis. Children are disappearing, and it's your job to investigate. The pattern of the game is pretty similar to the previous games. Talk to everyone in town. If there's a castle, you'll need to wander around and find various items hidden in pots and dresser drawers. You'll also see these tantalizingly out-of-reach treasure chests that are visible behind locked doors. You then go outside, out of town, walk around in circles to gain a few levels. Once you're strong enough to deal with the slightly tougher monsters between you and the next town, you can then head out to that town and then kind of repeat the whole process over and over again. You'll talk to villagers who will give you clues as to the location of a nearby dungeon. There's typically some kind of quest item and a boss at the bottom of each dungeon. Then the next area is unlocked and you keep going, typically alternating between town and dungeon. Each Dragon Quest game so far has added on a bit more plot than the previous one, so Dragon Quest IV has quite a lot of story and a lot of characters, much more so than Dragon Quest III or stuff like Glory of Hercules. So anyway, about those lost kids, a missing husband has also been reported back in Berlin. In a nearby town, you'll find this mysterious guy in jail who's lost his memory. There's a lot of jail cells in this game for some reason. Now, could this guy be the missing husband? So if you go back to Berlin and tell the wife, she'll follow you to the jail and his memory will return. For some reason, he knows the location of this hidden playground that the local kids are talking about. Visiting this will lead you into a mysterious underground passage to a dungeon. Dragon Warrior 4 introduced several concepts to the series. One of them is having friendly monsters who will fight on your side. In this dungeon you will encounter Healy, who will join your party. Now you can't control Healy in battle, he's controlled by the AI. But he's vital since Ragnar doesn't know any magic, and Healy can, obviously, cast a healing spell. Eventually you'll find some missing kids in a nearby tower and face the first boss, who is named Sorrow's Shadow. In later translations of the game, he's named Sorrow's Pawn, which makes a bit more sense. Sorrow will turn out to be sort of the main bad guy in this. Now while he's dying, he says something about trying to kill the hero. That is, there is a prophecy of a young man who will defeat the forces of evil, so monsters are killing children randomly in hopes of accidentally killing the hero as well. After you drop the rescued kids off, you return to Berlin and inform the king that you want to go on a quest to find this unknown hero. The king then grants you a bunch of experience points, just like that. Kings can do that? Maybe Lord British from Ultima sort of set the tradition in this. And here, Chapter 1 ends, and now Chapter 2 begins. In Chapter 2, you take control of Alina, a tomboy princess who wants to go adventuring, but whose father, the king, refuses to let her leave the castle. You need to spend a bit of time exploring the castle and talking to everyone. Eventually you'll be able to break a hole in your bedroom wall, jump onto the roof, and escape. Now I have sort of a problem with the sprites in this episode. The orange pixels below Alina's chin looks like a beard to me, so she makes me think of some like Highlander warrior dude or something. Here's the official character art, and yeah, I don't see the resemblance at all. Then there's her two lower retainers, Bray and Christo. And when I see Christo's sprite, I can only think of him as being like this redneck dude with a beard and kind of unkempt hair, wearing a trucker hat and a shirt with the sleeves torn off. But no, this is what he's supposed to look like. On the other hand, Bray's sprite is pretty accurate. Both Bray and Christo are magic users, so you'll get helpful spells for healing, attacking, and teleporting back to a village that you visited earlier. This spell, Return, as the game calls it, will be used a lot in the last episode. After screwing around a little on the overworld, when you come back to the castle, the king has lost the ability to talk, and of course there's a guy out there somewhere who knows what the cure is. Eventually you'll find him in a nearby castle. Once you find the birdsong nectar and bring it back to the king to cure him, he gives you permission to go out exploring. You head out to a nearby castle, Endor, where a tournament is being held, the winner of which will get to marry the princess. The princess doesn't want to marry any of the contestants, so she wants Elena to win, since a female winner of the tournament would be disqualified from marrying the princess. The arena is like a huge building behind the castle, and you can enter the main door and watch the tournament for a bit. Eventually you will need to actually enter the tournament as a contestant, and to win you'll need to defeat 5 opponents, and then you must defeat the current champion, a mysterious and extremely powerful dude named Necrosaro. Now the first guy is this wimp named Hun. And the second is this sort of anime-looking dude called Rorik. Elena doesn't know magic, but between fights you can use your stock of medicinal herbs to refill your health points. Your fourth opponent is a sexy witch who can hit you with some powerful magic. And then there's this guy. The Dragon Quest games reuse sprites a lot, and this is just the standard sprite for the knight style of enemy, which had appeared in previous games. The fifth enemy, which is just the standard Dragon Quest Yeti sprite, is incredibly annoying since he creates 3 identical duplicates and they switch places after every turn. And there's actually no way to distinguish the real one from the fakes, so you have an exactly 25% chance of hitting the real enemy when you attack. And this jerk sticks out his tongue at you whenever you miss. Finally, it's time to fight the fearsome Necrosaro. But he doesn't show up and you win by default. Then things start getting a bit weird. When you return home to your castle, it's completely empty, other than the cat. There is really nothing to do here in the castle, so once you leave, the episode ends. The third episode is probably the most interesting, at least at a purely formal level, as much of your goal involves stockpiling money rather than finding quest items or defeating monsters. Talking to this guy will get you started on making some cash. He wants you to push him to the House of Healing. That's the building which looks like a church where the priest will cure you of poison or other ailments. Just about every town has one. If you're playing on the original hardware, these are very important because this is the only place you can save your game. And pushing this guy there can actually be a huge pain in the ass. Damn it. Okay, let's try again. Oh, come on. Maybe this dude just isn't worth the trouble. Talon is probably the most popular character from Dragon Quest IV. He's appeared in a few spin-off games of his own. He's a hard-working family man who just wants to achieve success in his business. Sounds relatable, but his goal is to become the most successful arms merchant. Yeah, so Talon wants to become a war profiteer. Yikes. Well, Talon starts out working the counter at someone else's weapons store, and this is how you start making money. It's incredibly repetitive, even by 8-bit JRPG standards. You just answer everyone's question about whether or not this is a weapons store, and then sell them the weapon they want. You do this until the sun goes down and the shop closes. Your boss pays you, then you go home and sleep. It's annoying and boring, and I'm not sure why it's in the game. Is this some kind of commentary on the drudgery of working retail? Or some kind of commentary on the mindless, repetitive nature of JRPGs? Like you're just hitting a button over and over again? Did they legitimately think players would enjoy this? I'm not really sure. Once you have some money to buy weapons and armor, you can go out and start grinding. The nice thing about Talon is that he lives in the town, so he can sleep at home instead of at the inn. And also his wife packs him a lunch every day, which will restore health points when he eats it. So he doesn't really have to spend money on inns or herbs. Unlike the other characters, Talon doesn't really have any companions for his travels. He can, however, hire this mercenary to accompany him. Talun's money-making quest begins in earnest when this rich collector dude in Endor wants him to find a rare statue. After a quick trip to the local dungeon, Talun sells him the statue for a whopping 25,000 gold pieces. This allows him to buy a shop from an old dude in town who wants to retire. Because of the increased number of monsters roaming around, the King of Endor needs more weapons and armor, and places an order with Talun. In this rather annoying section of the game, you'll need to either get the necessary broadswords and half-plate armors from a nearby dungeon, where the monsters often drop them, or just by fighting monsters and getting enough gold to buy the stuff in a nearby town. And I guess maybe at some point I should bring up Dragon Warrior 4's downright obnoxious inventory system. Each character can hold 8 items, and this includes the armor and weapons that you have equipped. So the weapon, body armor, helmet, and shield is 4 items. There's typically a quest item or two which you cannot drop or sell. Maybe you have a lunch or a medicinal herb, and after all this you basically got 1 or 2 inventory slots left. So you cannot carry a lot of loot out from a dungeon crawl. You can use your healing item, then head on out hoping you get a good drop along the way, and you'll probably carry out 2 good items dropped by monsters. But yeah, the extremely limited inventory space is a major source of annoyance in this game. Okay, so once you've finally filled the order, the king pays you 60,000 gold pieces, which will then be needed to complete the construction of an undersea tunnel that will allow people to travel from one continent to another. Once this is done and Talun enters the tunnel, the chapter is over. But before that, we'll point out that in Endor there's a casino that is opened. And yes, Dragon Quest IV introduces everyone's favorite part of the series, gambling. Now you're not exactly gambling for money here. I mean, yes, you have to spend money to purchase chips, or coins as the game confusingly calls them. If you end up winning a lot of chips, you can trade them in for rare items. Most notable are the Meteorite Armband and the Metal Babel Shields, which are the best shields in the game. If you're playing on an emulator and don't mind a time-saving cheat, you can use save states to make a bundle of cash very quick by playing double or nothing poker. Okay, so once Talun marches into the tunnel, the chapter ends, and we are now at Chapter 4, the Sisters of Mon Baraba. And the thing about this game is, if your favorite part of JRPGs are the early parts where you have no good weapons, and you have 10 hit points, and you have to spend an hour killing slimes and gophers and sleeping in the inn after every few battles, then this is the game for you because you have to do that 5 times. Once every time a new chapter starts. Mara and Nara are the 2 sisters out to avenge the death of their father by one of his students, a guy named Balzac. The Japanese name was like Barazaku, so I assume it's a direct reference to the French author, but it's funny because it sounds like Balzac. Now one of the sisters is this sort of Carmen-esque dancer that drives men crazy, and then there's the more serious one who's a fortune teller. I always get them mixed up, but I think the fortune teller is the fighter and the dancer is the magic user. Much of their episode centers around mysterious goings-on at the castle of Kelon. There's a new mysterious king that no one has ever seen. They learn that the king is in fact Balzac, and that his council, or the second in command, is scared of loud noises, and once suddenly disappeared when some dynamite went off. So, will you be able to solve the mystery of Kelon Castle? Yes, you need to go to this abandoned mine to find a barrel of dynamite, and boy, is this town messed up and polluted. Everyone is either dead or sick. The sister's father's former apprentice, Orin, agrees to help them avenge their dead father. And he also tells you that your dad had discovered the quote-unquote secret of evolution, and that Balzac killed him and stole the secret. Orin provides some much-needed support since monsters are pretty tough at this stage in the game. The climax of episode 4 comes when the sisters and Orin sneak into the castle and blow up the barrel of dynamite near the consul's room. You then sneakily follow him and discover there's a hidden door in the hallway, and you then enter the hidden throne room of Balzac. Balzac bids you to marvel at his superior body, which might be pretty hot if you're a furry. Luckily, you earlier found the Sphere of Silence, which when used in battle will prevent Balzac from casting his rather nasty fireball spell. Once Balzac is history, his supervisor, Kelon, shows up and decides to deal with you personally. This is one of those battles that you will automatically lose, and I suspect if you used a cheat code to defeat him, it would break the game. You wake up in jail, fully healed for some reason. Luckily your cellmate, some old dude, just happens to have a boarding pass which will grant you access to a ship in a nearby port. While escaping, Orin bravely sacrifices himself for the sisters. Goodbye, Orin. I'll never forget your bravery. The sisters then need to head on to a coastal town and hop onto the ship, which you can board because you now have the boarding pass. The most impressive moment of this episode is when this giant ship starts moving and scrolls right off the screen. It travels to Endor, that was the same city where Talun has his shop. And thus that's the rather downhearted ending to episode 4, the darkest episode in the game so far, and now the 5th and final chapter begins. One thing about Dragon Quest IV is that the world map is huge, larger than Dragon Quest III. It's not easy to find your way around. However, the US release included a very useful fold-out map. It also had maps of the dungeons for the first 4 chapters, which sounds like cheating, but wandering around blind in this game is pretty painful. So let's take a look so we can see the context in which the game so far has taken place. Episode 1, Ragnar's story, takes place in the sort of northern European part of the world. Episode 2, Alina's episode, takes place in the far west. At the end of her episode, she crosses the sea and goes to Endor to fight in the tournament. Endor is sort of like the central location in this game. For Episode 3, Talun's hometown is on the same landmass as Endor, but far to the north. A mountain range to the east prevents him from traveling to Ragnar's turf. Talun, of course, sets up shop in Endor, and then builds a tunnel which allows travel to the area on the east of the mountains. In Episode 4, Mara and Nara come from a town on the south end of this continent that looks like South America. They end up boarding the ship on the northeast coast and sail towards Endor. This leaves pretty much the entire eastern half of the world unexplored, and there's various islands and such that you'll encounter later as well. Episode 5 basically takes up the second half of the game, and begins in this tiny little town hidden in a forest. Uh-oh, well, I guess I should have picked a better name. Okay, so we start here with our hero, ABC, a young man living a simple life in this tiny hamlet when... So ABC is hidden in a cellar while a terrible battle rages. Eventually he emerges and discovers the town has been completely destroyed and all that's left of his girlfriend is her hat. Pretty sad for an NES game. But this is actually pretty good dramatic storytelling here. Other RPGs of this era have somewhat involved stories, but the way Dragon Warrior 4 kind of weaves this narrative throughout the game, revealing the existence of some sort of chosen one near the end of the first episode, slowly showing the evil machinations of the game's villains, and in the final episode it brings the entire cast together and eventually resolves the plot. It's not easy to do this in the format of an 8-bit video game. On the other hand, this game is incredibly long, and the narrative is dropped for long periods of time while you wander around fighting monsters and exploring dungeons. And honestly, after completing this, I was pretty confused and had to kind of look up the plot online because I couldn't remember exactly who Balzac was and what his connection to Necrosaro was, because quite frankly, less than 1% of this game is dialogue in which you are told what's going on, and 99% is just grinding for experience or just wandering around aimlessly looking for your next objective. Okay, so after leaving his destroyed home village, ABC will find a nearby town and the tunnel built by Talon connecting the two parts of the world. From there you go to Endor, where, as you'll recall, Mara and Nara escape to. Running into Nara, she will tell your fortune, and realize that you are the chosen hero who will defeat the forces of evil. Before too long, you'll find this guy in the desert who has a wagon. You need to find some item at the bottom of a dungeon to convince him to join your party, but when he does, he brings along the wagon. Alright, so you're thinking, a wagon? That's useful for carrying supplies and equipment and stuff. Throughout the game, we've been loaded up with armor, weapons, quest items, healing items, and our inventory is very limited, so we can just carry around everything in the wagon, right? That solves all our problems with inventory. Anything we don't want or need at the moment can just be stowed in the wagon. Well, it turns out no. The wagon doesn't do that. We can't actually carry anything in the wagon. What's the wagon for? Well, by the end of the game your party has expanded to 8 members, and the wagon probably is there to avoid having to have 8 sprites on the screen at once while you're walking around in the overworld. So you can have 4 active party members. That is, they fight in battles, and the other 4 hide out in the wagon. Regardless, the wagon became a staple in future Dragon Quest games. You can choose your active party by using the Tactics menu, and then selecting what 4 characters you want to use. This can only be done in the overworld. You can't pull the wagon through dungeons, so once you enter a dungeon you're stuck with those same 4 characters. Now another standard Dragon Quest feature introduced here is tiny medals, or small medals as Dragon Warrior 4 calls them. And yes, each medal you find takes up 1 space in your already overly full inventory. The real challenge in Dragon Quest IV is not fighting monsters, it's managing inventory space. Luckily, once you get the boat, you can hypothetically go see the Tiny Medal King and give him your extra medals, but the part of the map that he lives in has some really tough monsters, so you are not probably at this point strong enough to deal with those. So going back to the game's plot, none of the ships in this town can leave the harbor because of an evil lighthouse. After you enter the dungeon and take care of the lighthouse, you meet Talon, who joins your party, and he comes with a ship. Much like Dragon Quest III, you have forms of sea and air transportation. Next, you'll run into Elena, Bray, and Christo. You need to get some special item to cure Christo of some disease. Then, once Elena realizes you're the chosen hero guy, they join your party. So moving right along, you end up heading back to Kelon. That's the castle where Mara and Nara defeated Balzac. Turns out Raglan, your character from episode 1, is being kept there as a prisoner. So you must once again fight Kelon, but by now your 4-character party is pretty buff, and you will totally be able to take this guy on. Dragon Quest IV was something of a turning point for the series. It introduced a number of elements that were reused in later games, and 4, 5, and 6 are sort of grouped together as a trilogy. It's also the first Dragon Quest game to sell fewer copies than its predecessor. Dragon Quest V sold even fewer, though of course it still sold very well comparatively. But it wasn't until the massively successful Dragon Quest VII in 2000 that the series was able to beat the sales of Dragon Quest III. I assume it was Dragon Warrior 4's lowest sales in the United States that resulted in Enix not releasing either of the 16-bit games here. Perhaps encouraged by the success of Dragon Quest VII, a PlayStation remake of Dragon Quest IV was released in 2001 in Japan. Various changes were made to this version. For example, there's a prologue taking place in the hero's village. This was added on to the game's beginning, and an additional episode was added on to the end. Then in 2007, the PlayStation version was ported to the 3DS and released in North America the next year. This might be the best way to play Dragon Quest IV. The menus and interfaces have all been improved, and in Episode 5 you can control all of your party members in battle, not just the hero. We'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes. So once you've gathered up your entire 8-member crew, your next objective is to obtain the Zenithian Equipment Set. This requires you to explore the rest of the world map, and there's a good 8 dungeons or so in the rest of the game. The entire game has around 25 dungeons, and if we check our world map, there are a total of 58 locations that are noted. So this is a huge game. If you take a look at the map at this point, you'll notice that some regions, like Elfville, are completely surrounded by mountains and cannot be reached by foot or ship. So how are we going to get there? Now also, there are, I think, 4 keys to find in this game. Each kind opens more types of doors. The last key we find is called the Final Key, and allows us to open the prison doors. So you'll need to go back to every location that had a prison door and grab any goodies found inside. And inside these treasure chests you'll find money and valuable or rare weapons and armor. Now I won't bore you with all the specifics of the late game Dragon Warrior 4, so let's discuss the rather irritating mechanics of this game. First of all, the menus. Oh good lord, Chunsoft just loves menus. Need to open a door? Press the menu button, use the D-pad to select door, and then open the door. Want to open a chest or look inside a drawer or a pot? Open the menu, go down to search, then hit the button to check if there's an item inside. This doesn't sound too bad, but keep in mind there are a countless number of drawers, jars, and chests in this game. If you're trying to get all of the tiny medals and helpful items hidden in this game, then you are going to be spending a lot of time navigating this menu over and over again. Inventory management is even worse. As I mentioned, each character has 8 slots, of which 4 will pretty much always be taken up by their equipped weapons and armor. If you've given them a meteorite armband, then you only have 3 empty slots. Quest items cannot be dropped, but they can be stored at Tulun's old shop in Endor. But even so, at any point in the game you'll probably have at least a couple undroppable items in your inventory. So when going through a dungeon, your inventory can get full pretty quick. So you'll often need to move items from character to character, especially when the chosen one needs to equip something. His inventory is almost always full, since unless you move him to a lower spot in the lineup, any items found will automatically go into his inventory, until it fills up. To move items, you need to open the menu, select items, choose the character who has the item that you want to move, select the item, select transfer, then select the person you want to transfer it to. Performing an action like this will close the menu, so if you want to then equip the item or transfer another item, you will need to reopen the menu and go through the whole procedure for every item. Pretty much everything, except for just walking around, is done via menus in this game. A game that's this long will make you despise these menus. You will consider the menu to be your worst enemy in this game. I mean, let me tell you, if you were to play Dragon Warrior 4 and then start Final Fantasy 3, that is the Famicom version, when you come across the first chest in that game and you realize you can open it and take the item with one button press, let me tell you, you will be eternally grateful to not have to go through Dragon Quest IV menu hell a second time. One other very bizarre thing about Dragon Warrior 4 is the combat in Episode 5. I assume this is done to make the game go by faster, but you only control the hero, ABC here. All the other characters are controlled by the AI. Now the combat in this game is very simple. It's basically press the A button over and over again, but there are definitely times when the AI character does whatever the hell it wants to, including using magic that will be ineffective on the enemy. For example, the beat and defeat skills are insta-kill spells, which means that pretty much all bosses are immune to them, but your magic casters don't know that. Christo in particular loves to use beat over and over again, or he'll use fire attacks on fire-based enemies, which typically does no damage. Sometimes characters will defend rather than attack for no good reason, and there are times when you really wish that they would heal the party, but they just keep using worthless spell attacks instead. So often it's up to you to keep the party healed. Now there's supposedly this AI system that allows them to learn whether or not to use a spell on the enemy after trying 3 times, I think. But regardless, a lot of turns get wasted by your AI controlled members. Another common issue is that when you select the hero's target, if he doesn't attack first, sometimes an AI party member will choose to attack the hero's target and kill it, which thus wastes the hero's turn. Unlike Final Fantasy, your characters will not retarget a different enemy in this situation. Now you can use a Game Genie code to allow control over all the party members in Episode 5, and this will certainly at the least lower your blood pressure during boss battles. Now on the positive side, Dragon Warrior 4 does have a pretty sophisticated narrative for an 8-bit RPG. The fact that you often find yourself returning to areas you have visited before gives the world sort of a more cohesive feel. Especially near the end of the game, it introduces some creative environments, such as a dungeon in the form of a giant statue. You can go outside in a couple places, like here you can access the statue's hand. You need to make your way to the top of the statue and activate its controls in order to move it. So is that thing sticking out of the front of the statue its dick? Anyway, once you move it, you can travel to a previously inaccessible part of the world. Another clever moment, once you get the Staff of Transformation, you can change into monsters, and you'll need to do this in order to infiltrate this castle and attend a meeting of the bad guys, including Necrosaro himself. I think this might be the first point in the game where you actually see Necrosaro. An ancient evil being named Esturk has been awoken. And I'll admit, I can't really make any sense out of Necrosaro's sprite here, but according to the official art, he looks like this. And naturally, your next move is to go out and whack Esturk. The art by Akira Toriyama is, as usual, one of the highlights of the game. His monster designs often sit on the fence between cute and creepy, and his cartoonish art style is well suited to the 8-bit graphics of the NES. Now this game reuses a number of enemies from previous games, such as the series mascot, the humble blue slime, and its rarely encountered cousin, the metal slime, which is hard to hit, almost always runs away, but it does drop huge amounts of experience if you successfully kill it. A lot of old favorites such as trolls, zombies, toxic toads are missing, but it does introduce some important new monsters like the King Slime, and the Metal King Slime, who is tough as hell but drops a buttload of experience points. As the game winds up, you find yourself with a hot air balloon. This allows you to travel to pretty much every remaining place on the map, like Elfville, that elusive spot surrounded by mountains. You'll find the final piece of Zenithian armor here stuck in this giant tree, and again, look how cool this thing is. I mean, probably the closest we've seen to this level of visual creativity so far has been maybe the Gonbar Goemon RPG. Now once you've got all the pieces of the Zenithian gear, and really all the best equipment possible, like the metal Babel sword, a couple metal Babel shields, and the various weird pieces of equipment for the magic casters, once you have all this stuff, then you're ready to hit the Zenithian Tower, the game's final destination on the world map. And this tower is horribly tricky and a confusing mess of stairs, doors, elevators and such, and I really hate it, and all the dungeons in the second half of the game are kind of like this. So you finally ascend, literally on a cloud, to the flying city of Zenithia, and this place is run by Valkyries, and the guy running the show is a dragon who tells you that you're not human, but rather Zenithian. So after that's all done, you get sent down to the Dark World for the final showdown. There's Necrosauro's castle there, but there's a force field surrounding it, so you have to knock out the force field by dealing with these 4 mini-bosses who live in each corner of the world. A couple are pretty simple, like just some of the tougher overworld enemies. Others are a bit more boss-like. One thing that Dragon Warrior 4 just loves to do near the end of the game is place damaging tiles everywhere. You need to use your Step Guard spell a lot in the Dark World. That prevents you from taking damage when you walk over them. Now this bit right here was probably the most surprising moment in the game for me. I really can't think of any other Japanese Famicom games off the top of my head that tried to do like a perspective trick like this. I mean, there may have been some, but I can't think of one. So like I said earlier, this game can be visually impressive. So finally, the big boss, Necrosauro, and that's a rather interesting choice they made there. Anyway, through the discovery of the secret of evolution, Necrosauro is able to transform into some sort of alternate body. He actually has multiple stages, something we'll see again later in RPGs like Dragon Quest VI and Final Fantasy IV. So he has like 7 or so different sprites as he transforms. First he loses each of his arms, then his head comes off, which seems like it would finish him off. But then a new head sprouts out of his stomach. And he finally grows new arms, legs, and a second head for his final form. And at this point, he's actually pretty tough. Your magic user keeps casting useless spells, and you'll spend a lot of time casting your most powerful healing spell, and occasionally reviving a party member. Now, Elena is far and away the most useful fighter in this battle for causing damage, especially if she's armed with these stiletto earrings, which allow her to attack twice in battle. She has a very high chance of doing a critical hit, which does way more damage, so she is absolutely essential for the final boss fight. But for you, the hero, you pretty much just need to keep healing since Necrosarl attacks twice per round and uses very powerful magic attacks that hit the entire party at once. With almost 5,700 hit points, this guy will take a while to go down. Now, as is the tradition, his death will cause the whole secret lair thing to implode, but the Dragon King dude flies in the last second to rescue you. Now, having a huge-ass dragon on your side would have made the whole boss fight a lot easier, I assume, but I guess this guy had other things to do. So back in Zenithia, the Dragon King says that you can live there, but you choose to return to Earth with your friends. The final challenge is leaving the castle. Some Valkyries block the main staircase, so you have to find a door that takes you into the back of the castle and then out a different door. I mean, I can't say that I blame ABC for leaving because Zenithia appears to be just like a single castle sitting on a cloud, and it doesn't really look like a very happening place. The very long ending cutscene has you flying around the world to everyone's hometown to be reunited with their family and whatnot. So, is Dragon Quest IV worth playing? I don't know. I mean, it's long, really long, and very repetitive, even for an 8-bit RPG. The constant pattern of town dungeon can get very repetitive very quickly, as can the combat, especially during the 5th episode when everyone but the hero is controlled by the AI. This here robs the combat of any sort of sense of strategy, as you really can't plan a coordinated attack. Overall, Dragon Warrior 4 is relentlessly grindy and overly simplistic. That's part of the game's appeal, I suppose. But in 2020, it feels like there are just better things to do with your time. I mean, I guess in a way the reason this part of the episode is so long is because I wanted you guys to see Dragon Quest IV so you wouldn't have to play it yourself. And I played this with a cheat that doubled the experience in gold after each battle, and sometimes also enabled other cheats to speed things up. But even so, it just felt endless. I can't even imagine playing this all the way through without those cheats. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff in the game, but it's all spread out between hours of wandering around, opening countless drawers and fighting the same battles over and over again. It concludes with the hero returning to his destroyed home village and his girlfriend comes back to life. Then all your party members appear. I don't know. I don't know what this means. So, Dragon Warrior 4, a beautifully crafted and ambitious JRPG that will absolutely wear you down and make you hate it. If that's your bag, then by all means, go ahead. Okay, the last game this episode, and woo boy, I was not expecting this. I was thinking that Infiltrator would easily take the prize for most annoying game of 1990 so far, and then Arctic came along. This looks innocuous. It's cute, right? Active rail playing. Huh, so it's like a train simulation game? Is rail playing some kind of pun on role playing? The answers to these questions are A, no, and B, I have absolutely no idea. This is published by Pony Canyon, the record label, and developed by ArtDink, one of the very few ArtDink games we'll encounter in this series. They were mostly a developer of computer games like HR2, Let's Make a Bigger Building Than Anyone Does. In the 90s, they'd get more exposure in the US with their A-Train games, as well as certain cult favorites like Tactics Ogre and No One Can Stop Mr. Domino. Arctic, on the other hand, ooh boy, this is a piece of work. The idea here is that you have these elaborate little tracks. There are blue and yellow balls, as you can see, and there are blue and yellow terminals. You can see them at the bottom, and then there's also another two at the top. So the balls are launched out of the terminals at the beginning of each level, and your goal is to get them back into the terminals. So what about the white balls? They just move around on the tracks. They can accidentally get stuck in a terminal and can collide with another ball, causing it to reverse course. Now those little green things in the center and the lower middle terminal are bouncers. If a ball hits one, it will bounce back again, and again cause it to reverse direction. Those little circles with the lines are switches and will change the direction a ball moves at an intersection. It's sort of like a real-life railroad switch, but not really. It took me a bit of time to conceptually understand this, but when a switch is flipped so that the ball will turn rather than go straight, the switch will only work if the ball is coming from the right direction. Specifically, the ball can only turn at angles greater than 90 degrees. You turn the switches by using the A and B buttons. One button turns the blue switches and one button turns the yellow switches. Try not to get them mixed up. So here's an example of how this works. A ball is moving down this way towards the blue switch, and the angle is 135 degrees, so that the ball turns and goes up the path to the green bouncer. However, if the ball is coming from the top of the screen this way, the angle is only 45 degrees, too sharp for the ball to turn, so it ignores the switch and just goes straight, which is obviously impossible in a real-life switch on an actual railroad track. The train would derail because a section of the track is turned the wrong way. So the upshot is, to enter the upper terminals you have to come at it from the southeast, and to enter the lower terminals you need to be coming from the northwest. These levels are more or less circular, so you often have to find a way to get your ball to reverse direction, such as hitting a bouncer or colliding with another ball. But then you'll typically need to flip a few switches to make sure that they don't just hit the other ball again and reverse direction a second time. So, not surprisingly, this is a port of a computer game. It was released on a few different Japanese platforms, such as the MSX and FM7. The MSX ROM is dated 1987. Now, all of this doesn't sound that bad on paper, I guess, but then we get to the music, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to have in a game like this. If you are trying to keep track of multiple balls moving quite fast simultaneously around the track with like a dozen switches, this music is not going to make that easy. It's like someone standing next to you and yelling at you constantly. After playing this for around 10 minutes, watching those balls just go around and around with the music playing, I started getting a headache. This is one of the few games where I've had an actual physical reaction to it. Not just making me frustrated, but I feel like I gotta stop playing this game or I'm gonna get sick. It's really weird. Now you might be wondering, can you pause the game to sort of take a look at the track and figure out your strategy? Nope. Hitting the start button launches all the balls out of the terminals, which you will need to do if a ball just happens to end up in the wrong terminal, by the way. And hitting the select button opens up the options menu, but this resets the level so you have to start again. And of course, you can turn the volume off, which I would recommend if you're going to play this, but video games really shouldn't have music that's this non-conducive towards playing the game. So anyway, this is a strong contender for one of my least favorite Famicom games. I mean, it's not bad in a funny way, it's just bad in an unpleasant way. Wow, let me tell you, between Infiltrator and Arctic, this episode nearly killed me. And I am torn I say, when it comes to giving out the best and worst game awards this time. And I hate to cheat, but best game goes to Super C and Dragon Quest IV. I enjoyed Super C a lot more than Dragon Quest, but Dragon Quest was probably the big game for the Famicom in 1990. It's loved by millions, so what the hell, it deserves the trophy. Worst game, again a tie between Infiltrator, a game I hated, and Mottomo Abunai Deka, a game I kind of liked. I mean, it's just so stupid. How can you not love a game this trashy? As for Arctic, it can just screw off. Next episode, well, I don't know. I've never played any of the games that will appear in episode 56. There's 2 US-only releases that I've absolutely never heard of. There's a couple of ports of arcade games that I'm barely familiar with, but for the most part, I'm walking into this completely blind. So this wraps up episode 55, and I'll see you next time.